Hello. Thank you, John and Heidi, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all so much for being here. My name is Wyatt Ship, and I'm currently a student at Principia College, where I double major in physics and religious studies. My topic, as you might have guessed by now, is ecological history in the Lake District. This was a topic that appealed to me because it was, just like my college experience, multidimensional. And I knew that it would allow for me to compile lots of different kinds of information from different sources. So, as we have to talk about ecological history and its impact and how people make decisions using it in the Lake District, you have to know what the ecological history of the Lake District is. So, the first people who came to the Lake District, or the area that would become known as the Lake District, settled this area over 4,000 years ago. The Lake District that they moved into was one that looked quite different from the one that we see today. It was a noticeably grassier Lake District with pockets of oaks on the fells. The valley bottoms were quite boggy, where megafauna roamed both those valley bottoms and the oaky fell grasslands. The people who came to the Lake District spent their time grazing their own domesticated animals on these grasslands, fishing in the tarns, and hunting and gathering. They cleared small areas of forest to build communities and attract wildlife. By 1000 BC, or BCE, the people in the Lake District were constructing both their own communities and established social systems, as well as stone circles like the one you see on the screen now. These people, however, were living mostly in the uplands at the tree lines on the fells. This all changed when the Romans conquered Britain. Ambleside is the most heavily occupied site, one would say, when talking about the Romans in the Lake District. It was an outpost protecting from the so-called barbarians of the north, east, and west, and it was on an important trade route to Ravenglass. I was able to go to Ambleside and see the ruins of the old Roman fort, and I noticed some key differences about the way that the Romans lived on this ground. As you can tell, the ground is not naturally very flat. You can see in the background that there are hills filled with trees, and in Roman times, certainly wildlife. However, where people built and settled, such as this outpost fort, the Romans completely flattened before they would build anything on a site. They cleared significant amounts of timber from the surrounding area to be used as building materials and as fuel. And even though they established these kinds of settlements, they did not drive out the Neolithic way of life which persisted in this area until much further. This is also the time period where we see stone starting to be used as a building material. This is a picture of Carlisle Castle, and while it was built significantly later, it symbolizes some important things about a special period in the Lake District's ecological history. After the Romans pulled out of Britain, the agricultural practices reverted back to a fairly Neolithic style. There was still multi-species grazing, an abundance of fishing, clearing small plots of land for farming, and and most of the settlement remained in the uplands. There was an increase of agriculture as the population grew, and as society started to evolve, we had more of these settlements that were built to, once again, protect people from raids. However, it was much more built up, as we can see in this picture from Carlisle Castle, which has a ditch and then a hill where the fortification is built on. We know that in about the year 900, the Norsemen settled and colonized Britain. Unlike the Neolithic-style people who were already living here, instead of colonizing the uplands, they colonized the valleys like Ennerdale. They also cleared these valleys extensively as they colonized. The Norsemen did two very impactful things that shape our understanding of the Lake District today. The first is they gave a lot of names to some features that we now hold beloved. Names like Beck, Dale, Fell, and Thwaite. But they did something else which has also left a lasting impact. And that is they brought sheep to the Lake District. It is during the Norse occupation that we see sheep and shepherding first introduced to this area. It is also during this time period that most native fauna dies out. This leads us into sort of the Renaissance and Elizabethan era. The 16th century in specifically is the advent of expressively intensive mining practices and more agriculture practices, which also increase in intensity. Ugh. This is a picture that I took in Coniston, and while there are some lovely sheep in the foreground, in the background I would also like to point your attention to the slag heap, which is circled in red. These slag heaps are actually protected, which means that they can't be removed or tampered with. It is during this stage in history, in the ecological history of the Lake District, that Renaissance ideas about hierarchy set in, like the kind that our group talked about when we visited Levin's Hall, which is the oldest topiary garden in Europe. It is ideas like the Renaissance hierarchy that justified grave exploitation of the land and removal of its resources for human use. This is a painting that is featured in the Wordsworth Museum's tourism exhibition called View of Wastwater. It's painted by William Green, and it exemplifies what I think it exemplifies well the Lake District in the period leading up to and during Wordsworth's lifetime. The Lake District during Wordsworth's lifetime and leading up to it is, I think, best exemplified by a single word: exploitation. People in the Lake District and companies wanted to take all of the stuff out of the land of the Lake District. They saw the Lake District as a fertile area for farming, for mining, for forestry practices, and also for the shepherding that we know today. Especially shepherding, because as the wool industry and manufacturing system begins to take off in many parts of northern England, that wool needs to come from somewhere, and the Lake District is where it comes from. All of this cutting and shepherding and mining leads us to what we would now consider a more Wordsworthian view when we look at the landscape. This is also when tourism starts to become a factor in the Lake District. Ideas about a national area of preservation begin, and Wordsworth is even cited as advocating for, quote, a sort of national property, end quote, to be preserved. And finally, we are brought to more of a modern day idea of what you see when you go and adventure in the Lake District. Today's Lake District, we see a lot of things that are responding to ecological trends of the past. In the right photo, we can see evidence of the leftover effects, that's the word I'm looking for, from the increase in production-minded shepherding and agriculture which took place after the end of the First and Second World Wars. There was a big push for the idea of self-sufficient England and a headage policy which really advocated for as much intensive shepherding as possible. However, since then, we've also seen an uptick in concepts such as rewilding, which are present in Ennerdale, and projects such as Haweswater, which are run by people like Lee Schofield. We've also seen more attention given to sustainable farming practices like the kind James Rebanks talks about. Finally, as many of us know, the Lake District has been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which allows for greater tourist appreciation and attraction, but that also comes with an ecological impact on the environment. So, one of the things that I've noticed about the Lake District is that what I would call a Wordsworthian view, or inspired by Wordsworth view of the Lake District, is heavily promoted and marketed. Here's an excerpt from the poem Home at Grasmere, manuscript D, that Wordsworth's written. And with a sudden influx overpowered, at the sight of this seclusion, he, Wordsworth, forgot his haste, for hasty had his footsteps been, as boyish his pursuits, and sighing said, what happy fortune were it here to live, with paradise before him, here to die. The station whence he looked was soft and green, not giddy yet aerial, with a depth of vale below, a height of hills above. For rest of body, perfect was the spot, all that luxurious nature could desire. From flit from field to rock, from rock to field, from shore to island, and from isle to shore, from open ground to covert, from a bed of meadow flowers into a tuft of wood, from high to low, from low to high, yet still within the bound of this huge concave, here must be his home, this valley be his world. For the picture, I've selected a view similar to what Wordsworth is describing in this passage of coming up over one of the fells and looking down into the valley of Grasmere. Now, from this section of poem, we can extrapolate sort of what the area looked like when Wordsworth was here. We can tell that it was soft. He describes it as soft and green, of these gentle rolling hills with slopes, rocks, fields, islands, shores, open ground, and a bed of meadow flowers. But something that he only uses to describe once is a tuft of wood, which I believe implies that by Wordsworth's time, the woodlands were not as dominant as they had once been before. Now, something that I've noticed over the past 50 weeks is how this period, which lasted about 50 years, of what the lakes looked like when Wordsworth lived, is often held up as the gold standard of what the lakes should be like ecologically, advertising-wise, touristically, and economically. So, this idea of the Wordsworthian view of nature is very applicable in certain contexts. And asking and expecting the Lake District to take on this Wordsworthian view is reasonable when we look at the time period that Wordsworth lived. And one of the contexts in which it really excels is in a context where that is not so far in the past, and when that takes up a significant chunk of the past. And that Wordsworthian, let me just put the poem back up there, because I like this picture to sort of exemplify what the view is. But to be a part of this context in a society that has not changed much, in a landscape that has not significantly changed since Wordsworth has been observing this landscape. Now, I believe that although that is a very valid response to looking at the landscape and how it's been influenced by Wordsworth, that Wordsworthian view is not the only slice of ecological history that we have available to us. That we have this long and storied idea of ecological history. And I've highlighted a golden slice, which is how much time Wordsworth lived in the area, specifically after he arrived at Dove Cottage. And we can see here that there is a lot more ecological history, and that there is more variance in many of these species and their composition, and this tells us that the landscape is more dynamic and looks very different over time than what a single section or snapshot of history could look like. I like this picture because it shows in part how the landscape has also changed. One of the things that we learned over this abroad was the bracken, which one sees in the foreground, is known as the shadow of the forest. So that all of the space where the bracken is in the foreground, there was once trees beforehand. And that all of those conifers in the background, if we go back, the conifers are represented by the row closest on the right side. And we can see that during Wordsworth's lifetime is really when the population of conifers begins to increase. And it really skyrockets up to the present day. And we can see that here in this picture. So this is sort of my master timeline that I've compiled. And so the blue strips are significant periods in human history. The gold strip at the top, again, is Wordsworth's sort of general lifetime in the Lake District. And the orangish reddish strips are areas of particular exploitation or extinction of species in the Lake District. So I think that in looking at the ecological history of the Lake District, although Wordsworth's lifetime is an important and significant time period in the ecological history of the Lake District, it is not the only period. And so I think that in order to make better management decisions and in order to more completely encapsulate the history of the Lake District, we also have to look at everything outside of that gold line to create a more perfect picture. And I'm not saying at all that we should dismiss Wordsworth or any of his ideas or any of the things that were present during his time, but I look at this timeline and I think, wow, there's a lot more that we could be doing. And just as some of us are about to leave the Lake District in a few weeks, I'm going to leave you with this picture. And so thank you so much for coming again, and thank you for listening and for coming to this presentation.